Good evening. We are coming to you from France, and we are looking at worldwide education. We are here tonight with a South African educational specialist, Celeste Labuschagne, and we are asking her a few questions. The first one would be, can educational big data provide real-time alternatives to temporarily discrete assessment techniques and bureaucratic policy making?
Thank you very much. It's such a privilege. On your first question, whether the government like it or not, big data has arrived in education. Data can be gathered in various ways, such as educational data science, data mining, learning analytics, computer adaptive learning, cognitive systems for learning, etc. And even the artificial intelligence that's used in education these days are all part of education, and schools and universities and even online courses are all part of gathering this big data, all the data in education. Now, large-scale comparative data or big data, such as the data sets collected by the OECD, testing instruments, have been used in recent years by policymakers. The data collected have been used to help policymakers make informed decisions and drive reform in education. Data mining in education and analytics can be used to provide continuous data about learners' learning and the content suited to each learner. This eliminates basically the need for individual assessment as well as comparing countries to one another. This could also lessen the need to intervention or of intervention through policy. On the flip side, commercial organizations, for example Pearson, will take on a powerful role in education if this happens. And this could mean changes in education and prediction of outcomes in education at a much faster rate than government can. Now, when we talk about this question that you asked me, we need to get answers to a few other questions though. One of which is, what theories of learning underpins big data-driven educational technologies? Because data-driven platforms aim to optimize learning, but what do they mean by learning in this specific framework? The disciplines used in big data mostly treat learning as something that can be monitored and optimized like a computer program, with less emphasis on the social, cultural, political and economic factors that structures learning and the individual's experience of learning. So we must also look at questions about machine learning and how advocates like IBM and other companies looks at learning or how they define learning. They claim that machine learning is becoming more natural and human-like. But we must in this scenario ask whether learners' minds and the learning brain are seen as computable devices that can be debugged or rewired like a computer program. Even though there are other questions that need to be asked on who owns educational big data and various others, the one question we need to ask before we can say that educational big data can replace all discrete assessment techniques and replace bureaucratic policy making is, who can afford educational big data? And this is a big thing, because at the current or in the current situation in the world in education, there will be a lot of schools, universities, colleges, etc. who can simply not afford purchasing learning analytics or adaptive software platforms. This will cause more affluent institutions being able to afford these technologies and benefit from the real-time insights, while other institutions will remain bound to the bureaucratic analysis of temporary discrete assessment. This being said, I want to summarize my answer as follows. Yes, educational big data can provide real-time alternatives to temporally discrete assessment, but there are certain problems that we need to address first before it will become the ultimate answer to the assessment and policy problems in education.
Thank you. The next question, which one of the SDG 4 goals, that is Sustainable Development 4 goals, resonate or align with your area of interest? And what did you discover in the various data sets or databases about progress in this area?
Thank you for the question. On your question of which of the Sustainable Development 4 goals resonate or align with my area of interest and what I discovered in the various data sets or databases about the progress in this area, I would say Sustainable Development Goal number 4.4, which is about increasing the number of people with the relevant skills for financial success, is one of them. I have another that resonates, but I'm first going to discuss this one. This is about access to education. And as far as access is concerned, it is clear that equal access to education is still at this stage a target that needs to be reached. While working through the various data sets, it was evident that in some countries, for example, boys have better access to education than girls. Also, when it comes to access to computers and computer literacy, boys in certain countries have better access than girls. That is a concern. When I went about looking into data sets, I found that around the world, access to distance learning is not equal at all. The COVID-19 pandemic and the crisis in education that was brought about due to schools closing globally during the COVID-19 crisis showed the imperative in access to distance learning. The data collected from the data sets with regards to this aspect proved to me that governments, educational role players, and policy makers will need to pay close attention to ensuring that all learners across the world in every country has access to the possibility of online or distance learning to be utilized on a daily basis as in cases of a future pandemic. The second one is skills acquisition. When all learners have access to online learning or distance learning, the acquisition of the critical skills, or as I like to call it, the essential skills, will become easier as well. Just to remind you, those skills are problem solving, critical thinking, creativity, teamwork or collaboration, communication skills, and conflict resolution. The next SDG 4 goal that I had a look into and that resonates with my field of data sets was eliminate all discrimination in education. Now, I say it resonates because if we look at the discrimination here and the one that I've identified, it's not discrimination per se, but we need to look towards inclusion and equity. Learners, irrespective of where they live, whether they are poor or healthy, have the right to education. And as I've said earlier, all role players need to work towards a common goal of ensuring that whenever learning can happen face-to-face or When schools have to be closed due to a worldwide pandemic, learning can continue without the skip of a beat.
Thank you very much. The next question. Many teachers don't feel engaged or listened to when it comes to decisions that affect their classrooms. How can policymakers change that?
Yes, that is a very good question, because we all know that teachers, when it comes to policy, don't feel engaged or listened to. So for policy to work in the educational landscape, teachers need to buy into policy. For this to happen, it is important for teachers' voices to be heard. In South Africa, for example, there are a lot of policies in education that are currently just not working at all. I am not going to name any specific policies, but what I want to mention is that a lot of decisions are made higher up about what must happen in classes in schools. The biggest question among teachers about these decisions and policies is whether these decisions were made by people who actually knows what it is to stand in front of a class in a school in South Africa today. Teachers are rated using their learners' test scores. The problem with this is that not all schools currently have the same learner distribution. Top achieving learners are targeted by top achieving schools, while the more rural and urban schools are left with the average and the underachievers. So this means that test scores and marks are not a good measure to rate a teacher, according to me and according to teachers teaching in these rural and other urban schools. In America, this fact was acknowledged by the stakeholders, and what they did was they announced a year-long delay to evaluate teachers using test scores of learners. Education Secretary Arne Duncan said the following. He said, "I believe testing issues today are sucking the oxygen out of the classroom in a lot of schools." He added that teachers need time to adapt to new standards and tests that emphasize more than simply filling in bubbled answers to multiple choice questions. And that is from an article I accessed while doing my research. The National Network of State Teachers of the Year started engaging teachers in the policy process. Various opportunities were given to teachers in America to engage in policy conversations. Teachers are even trained in policy analysis and content, and teachers are given opportunities to use their voices to influence policy. One of the projects getting teachers involved I have mentioned in an earlier task, and this is an initiative by the District of Columbia where they actually select a teachers cabinet, and this teachers cabinet meet with Chancellor Wilson on a monthly basis. They have the opportunity to provide input on key policy decisions and share their classroom experiences. They also have the opportunity to discuss the concerns of teachers in the district. In other words, they become the voice for other teachers. Looking to South Africa, this is something we are in dire need of at present. Teachers in South Africa need their voices to be heard in policy making in the near future, for a lot of decisions are forced upon teachers and they are not necessarily agreeing with these decisions. Policy makers need to address this before we encounter an educational revolution.
Second to last question. What is your favorite or preferred data set or database that you explored during this module, And how do you see yourself utilizing it in future?
Well, yes, my favorite data set. I chose the joint survey on national education responses to the COVID-19 school closures as my favorite data set. This dataset contained worldwide data on how governments and ministries of education reacted during the COVID-19 pandemic. While working through this dataset and looking at what happened in education during this pandemic, it dawned upon me that this dataset can be used to drive informed policy making with regard to the availability of distance learning or online learning to every learner worldwide. And if we can't use this data set just as this, we can take a lot of knowledge from what was gathered in this data set and learn from that. In my case, I would want to apply the information gathered from the data to drive policy with regard to distance and online learning in South Africa. The data from the survey can be used to convince stakeholders in data provision, technology and education to buy into ensuring that every learner, irrespective of where they live or what school they go to, have access to online or distance learning. Ensuring that when schools need to be closed again due to a crisis in education or a worldwide pandemic, learning can continue effortlessly and seamlessly.
And the last question. Who do you want to give a shout out to that made all the difference to your success in this module?
Who do I want to give a shout out to? Well, in this case, I want to give a shout out to my husband and my 3 sons. They had to take over a lot of the duties I usually have. Things like making dinner, because I'm constantly busy either working or with my master's degree tasks. Especially this module kept me quite busy and I had to put a lot of time into this, but it was worthwhile. Then also 2 of the people that worked with me in previous group work activities, that is Marnelda and Deline. We used to call ourselves the Scormions, and we are still on a group on WhatsApp, and we are just there for support. So we can voice our concerns to one another, or when we have trouble with something, we give one another advice, and for that I want to give a shout out to Marnelda and Deline. Then also Celeste Wenzel, I'm sure she was mentioned about, she was mentioned by a lot of people. Just to know that when you have a crisis, she's there for support. I didn't really use it within this module, but just to know she's there gives a lot of confidence. And then to Nick Smith. He gave a lot of words of wisdom after reading my reflections in my journal, and for that I want to thank him. And then lastly, but not least, during the conversation, you would have heard something coming in my door, and that's one of my dogs. So I want to say thank you to both of my 2 big dogs for having patience with me when I don't give them any attention. Thank you.